Let me begin the paper by stating the problem first. In certain Chinese academic circles and among politicians, there persists the long-held misconception that from the 1840s onwards, British India was engaged in the illegal and wicked practice of shipping millions of pounds of Indian tea into Tibet. The overt reason was to earn silver and gold and to expand the wool trade, but the real reason was to seduce the Tibetans and to destroy the centuries-old Sichuan tea trade. But the hue and cry of the Chinese is really a bogeyman, that is, a fearsome creature that actually does not exist. And that's what this paper will address. Let me give a tiny bit of background first on tea itself, very shortly. Tea, as you know, is a plant. It is a single species called Camellia sinensis, that is the Chinese camellia. And so when you drink your green tea, your black tea, your oolong tea, your brick tea, whether it comes from Darjeeling or Assam or China or Sri Lanka or Kenya, it's all the same plant. It's all the same plant. And what makes such teas so different is in the picking, the processing, the treatment, and in the context of French wine, for example, you have to talk about the terroir character of tea, which is very, very important. Now to Tibet. From various sources, we can probably state with confidence that the first Tibetans began drinking tea at the very end of the 7th century, okay? Right at the end of the 7th century. It was a long time ago. The Chinese themselves only began drinking tea in around the late Han, say in the 3rd century. In the beginning, it would have been very limited, the amount of tea that got to Tibet, and we can say that only in the 11th century, during the Sung dynasty tea horse trade, did tea start coming to Tibet in large quantities. And it would be during the Sung dynasty, indeed, that Tibetan people in general encountered tea and began drinking tea in large quantities. We all know Tibetans need, love, like, want tea. It supplies hydration, nutrition, digestion, social interaction, hospitality, and various religious functions. And yet, throughout history, Tibetans have always consumed brick tea that always came from China and almost always from Sichuan province. Let me then quickly interrupt for those of you who perhaps haven't seen what a brick of tea looks like. It's not a very beautiful thing. Okay? And actually, this is not a particularly nice brick. These are various types. In more recent times, they've been wrapped in gold paper as a kind of a way of presenting tea, almost as though it were an ingot of gold. So it's a very nice wrapping to give as a gift. Brick tea comes in all different shapes, sizes, weights, anywhere from these, which are about 1 pound each, up to 2 kilo bricks, which are huge. That's nearly 5 pounds of tea in a single brick. There are many grades of tea, and Tibetan tea is well known for not actually having 100% tea leaves. In fact, there are very large percentages of twigs and even the gatherings from around the tea bush, that is, clippings of grass, hay, and so forth. And let me just tell a small anecdote. Dear Samten Karme, who's not here, he lived in Sungpan, which has always received inferior qualities of tea. And as a boy growing up, he said he never ever saw a leaf of tea. What he saw were twigs, sticks, and branches of tea. And he said his mother had to boil this stuff for hours, otherwise no effect at all. And so, just to make the point that tea comes in all varieties. A very quick history. Up until the 1600s, tea was a purely East Asian and Central Asian affair. Only in the 1600s did Europeans encounter tea, and to the Dutchmen here, you were the first Europeans to drink tea in a large quantity. Holland was more or less hooked by the 1670s. England, probably at the time of Queen Anne, around 1710, 1720. And when a nation gets a taste for tea, the taste grows and it becomes a necessity. So we then embark on the real subject of Tibetan tea and how the British are drawn into the story. Before 1823, nearly all tea in the world came just from China. The British were consuming more and more tea. There was, for example, up to 3 pounds per person in Britain per annum. That is, each person drinking up to 3 pounds of tea. They needed tea. And they somehow were desperate to break the outflow of silver going to China to purchase this tea. The British had two options, both of which they embarked upon. One was opium. That is, you get opium, grow opium, produce opium, and then use that to trade for tea. That's another story. That's the opium story, not the tea story. But the second possibility is that you actually grow the tea yourself. So the British are desperate to get going with growing tea, but it's difficult to get enough seeds and cuttings from China. And so, miraculously, in 1823, in Assam, they discover the tea plant. And it's the same Camellia sinensis. And they begin to cultivate it with considerable success. And we have news that tea made from indigenous Assam leaf was shipped to London in 1838, 12 chests of Assam tea, and the tea was well received. So here we begin with tea growing in this general area of the world. 1835, tea was first planted in Darjeeling, although it took until the 1850s for it to make any headway. I need to keep going. What we see is as the Indian tea becomes more and more successful, it's steadily breaking the grip of the Chinese on the world tea monopoly. And by 1888, Indian tea production had reached 86 million pounds, and for the first time, British tea imports from India exceed those from China. So that's in the tea story. 1888 is always held as an important year. It's the first time more tea was shipped from India to than from China. And there's a very quick anecdote dealing with Bhutan. If we go back to the time of Warren Hastings, he was the first Governor General of India from 1773 to 85. He arranged to ship to George Bogle in Bhutan tea seeds from China. Very far-sighted. And George Bogle reports that he took these tea seeds to the local governor of Tashi Chodzong, and this local governor was so happy he danced around the bag of tea seeds, and he said, finally, we may be able to escape losing so much silver to China for our tea. Unfortunately, tea didn't take in Bhutan, but it's an example of the far-sightedness. This, mind you, is 50 years before tea was even grown successfully in India. So it's an interesting little piece. Let me turn to the Chinese fears about Indian tea. Already in the 1840s, the Chinese and Tibetans were aware of British expansion. Tibetans watched with alarm as Britain spread into areas close to their border. Very quickly, by the 1820s, the British were taking Assam. 1835, they're up in the Darjeeling Hills. In 1841, we have the First Opium War. 1860, the Second Opium War. 1865, encroachments on Kalimpong and the British War with Bhutan. Interesting, in 1879, a road is pushed through to the Jalapla, just to the east of here. Which direction is east? There. So a road in 1879, and in 1881, the train is pushed through to Darjeeling. And in 1888, the events in Sikkim itself. So, from the Chinese point of view and the Tibetan point of view, they're getting closer, the road, the railway. There can only be one possible intent, and that, of course, is the real prize, which is to enter Tibet. Very quickly, why is tea so important to the Chinese? Why is the tea trade with Tibet so important to the Chinese? In 1879, a British consul sums it up quite nicely. He says, "The exclusive dependence on China for this important product of tea seems to me a political factor not to be underestimated. And I believe that if the monopoly of the tea trade were to be done away with, much of the Chinese influence in Tibet would be gone also." Then, quite simply, practical matters. Sichuan tea industry was vast, and it supplied huge revenues. For the Qing government, the Qing, mind you, was the last dynasty in China from 1644 to 1911. For the Qing court, increasing state revenues rather than procuring horses became the main purpose of the border tea trade. The livelihood of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people went to the tea trade. It was a way of contact and control of the border areas. It was a way of having influence with Tibetans in Lhasa and, of course, the great monasteries. Importantly, it was revenues from tea that helped maintain the Chinese army, although it wasn't big, in Kham and Tibet. And, of course, the Chinese received Tibetan goods, some of which were significant and important. Goods, medicine, gold, and silver coming down from Tibet. There's the role of diplomacy for tea as well. In the 1800s, the Chinese government gave tea as an annual gift, what might be called largesse tea, the Chinese word shang. The amount for the Dalai Lama was 5,000 pounds per year, for the Panchen Lama half as much, 2,500 pounds, and the Chinese called it shang shu cha, which more or less means largesse for your need tea. Very briefly on the statistics, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, the volume of the tea trade, although it varied, was consistently between about 12 million and 15 million pounds, between 12 million and 15 million pounds. In 1892, a high Chinese official named Liu Bingzhang reported, "After my survey, I know that Sichuan tea is sold in Tibet for 14 million jin annually," and a jin is more or less a pound. This raises the vexing problem of how many Tibetans were actually drinking tea, what was the population of Tibetans, and what is the per capita consumption of tea. That's another story, but it tends to confirm that in Tibet there was always a need for tea, that there was never enough tea. Now, to the actual Chinese alarm. Here is a description from 2006, a Chinese publication. "The British Empire invaded Tibet in 1888 and forced the Qing court to sign the unequal Sikkim-Tibet Convention in 1890. and then renewed it in 1893. As a result, Yadung in Tibet was made an open port where trading activities between the Tibetan, Indian, and British merchants were not taxed by one or the other. Hence, tea produced in India, monopolized by the British, poured into Tibet, and the production of and market for Sichuan brick tea dropped dramatically. Patently untrue. Even wilder claims, again from a Chinese publication. In the middle of the 18th century, not 19th, in the middle of the 18th century, the British adventurers considered that if they exported lots of Indian tea to Tibet, they would not only get lots of valuable medicine and industrial materials, but also cut the relations between Tibet and the central government. 18th century, mind you. They also say, when the British person Hastings was the Indian viceroy, he tried to export the Indian and Sri Lanka tea to Kham and Tibet to weaken the influence and power of the central government in Tibet. Warren Hastings, I just mentioned, in the 1770s, 1780s. Sri Lanka tea was not even begun to be grown till the 1840s, so you get some rather wild stuff coming out of China on this tea question. And various publications have lots and lots of statements, but we need to look at the official record as well. For example, in Guangzhou, 12th year, 1886, the Amban and Lhasa Si Leng in his report to the emperor, and the report is called Report on the English Traveling to Tibet and Teaching the Tibetan Barbarians. Quote, "The Tibetans like tea very much, and the tea depends on Sichuan. The tea is sold very well, and the profit and tax are very high. But I have heard recently that India also produces tea. If they make an agreement with the Tibetan government, we cannot stop the sale of Indian tea in Tibet, and this will leave Sichuan tea with no place to sell. So disaster is coming." This is 1886. In 1887, the 13th year of Guangzhou, many officials and high monks in monasteries reported to the Amban's office, and he reported, quote, "All the foreign barbarians have their evil intentions to do business. Take Calcutta for an example. We know how wicked they are, and now our barbarian people," meaning the Tibetans, "our barbarian people are doing business with these evil people. And this makes us unable to rest easy." Later in 1892, the Amban Shangtai, in a letter to the tax office, says, "But they all know this Indian tea will bring great inconvenience to the business of local Tibetan people and will do great harm to them. So not just common people, but also the government and merchants do not want this to happen." And finally, again, I only have this from a Chinese source. I've never seen the original, but it claims that the Dalai Lama expressed his ideas on tea through the Mongolian Tenzing Tuktu in a message to the emperor. And this was the message. "Tea is the big business of the Sichuan businessmen in the hinterland, and the Tibetan common people really desire it. If we allow Britain to sell Indian tea, we will lose lots of tax, so I demand that you prohibit this." And finally, in 1908, the Qing government appointed a man named Zhang Yintang to negotiate with the British delegates about previous trade treaties, and his concern, perhaps to gain favor with the Tibetans, says, "The Buddha's land will become the market of Britain and India, and the marvelous Chinese and Tibetan merchants will be mere servants in the future. Then we have the equivalent of industrial spies, that numerous Chinese were sent to the Darjeeling area to see what the situation was, and one of them reports, the administrator of the railway station at Darjeeling told me that the India tea, which was smuggled through Gartok to Tibet, can be 1,000 pounds every day. Gartok, as you know, is in far west Tibet, and indeed became one of the three trade marts after 1904. But we'll see in a moment that this is quite far-fetched as well. Let me sum up the Chinese position through the words of the very powerful and very important Zhao Erfeng. Many of you will know him. He was the Sichuan and Yunnan Border Affairs Minister. In 1908, he puts the matter succinctly and with a tone of alarm. I quote, "The processed tea sold under license to front and rear Tibet has been a major source of income for Sichuan province. But now, the India tea, grown in large quantities, processed in a superior way, shipped in an efficient transportation system, and sold by a gigantic company, has been squeezing our own tea merchants and seizing their profits. If not resisted, it will gallop eastward, not only causing us the loss of the Tibetan market, but also posing a threat to our tea-producing bases." So we've seen the the Chinese and Tibetan arguments, and I'm going to have to race ahead with what the British actually report. We've got how many minutes? 9 minutes, thank you. We have a British government report in 1873 listing the goods imported into Tibet from Bhutan and Darjeeling. These included broadcloth, rice, sugar, dried fruits, tobacco, stick lac, indigo, sandalwood, ivory, peacock feathers, rhinoceros horn, and cloth, but nowhere is there a mention of any tea. And then from the periodic reports on the external trade of Bengal, again listing lots and lots of statistics, lots and lots of products. In 1890, 1897, 1899, 1904, the report on the external trade of Bengal, nowhere any mention of tea. Sir Francis Younghusband, he himself sounded a tone of pessimism about trade in general and Indian tea in particular. By the way, his famous book, India and Tibet, has appeared in Chinese under the translated title, A History of How England Invaded Tibet. Concerning the Convention of 1890, Younghusband says, not the slightest use. Concerning Yadung and its position, he says, exceedingly badly chosen. And Younghusband states, just across the frontier are 3 millions of tea drinkers. We had hoped that the Chinese would meet our wishes in regard to the admission of tea, but through their obstinacy, any concession is of not the slightest use. Let me quickly just mention Yadung itself, just over the border there. In 1894, John Claude White, after a visit there, reported that, quote, the Chinese had built a wall across the valley, about 1/3 of the valley lower down, and posted sentries on the gate, and no one was allowed to come to the mart to buy or sell any goods whatsoever. He also mentions that just up the road at Pari, even if goods could get through the wall at Yadung, suddenly at Pari, they would add a 10% tax to anything coming through in direct violation of the trade agreements. And for Gartok itself, way out west, the Chinese position was the imperialists always at the same time used legal and illegal means to perform their economic invasion. When the British colonialists were negotiating with the local Tibetan government, they were also smuggling Indian tea to Tibet, especially through Gartok. But the fear of Gartok seems far-fetched. It's so far out, it's so isolated, often referred to as small, miserable, windy Gartok. Charles Schering in 1905 went on an inspection trip there, and he noted that the main trade was wool. He did see that there was a small smuggling trade. Thank you. A small smuggling trade performed by a local Tibetan official known as the Daba Dzongpan. What he did is he bought cheap Indian tea, then labeled it Chinese tea. He repacked it in the official government skins, and then sold it as the best Tibetan article. But this must have just been a very small-scale operation for this one Dzongpan. Frank O'Connor, also on a trip. Was it the same trip? O'Connor and Sharon? Yes. He says, Gartok in West Tibet has not the purchasing power, too slight population, and Indian tea might supplant Chinese tea, but never expect any large development. And in 1907, an official British report says, it was already apparent that Gartok was a dead end, and Alex McKay has also pointed out the Gartok agency was never of any real importance to the Raj. It was just for prestige and certainly not for Indian tea. We have a similar situation in Gyangtse, where Frank O'Connor reports that our trademark at Gyangtse will remain a dead letter, and furthermore, there will be no development of the tea trade or any other trade. And my last comment on the British is that in 1906, in the House of Commons debate in London, Mr. Laidlaw, he asks the Secretary of State of India, I beg ask the Secretary of State for India if there has been an increase of trade between India and Tibet since the late expedition of 1904, and whether Indian tea is now admitted into Tibet, and if so, how much and under what conditions. And Mr. Morley, the Secretary of State, he goes on about the volume of trade, that exports to Tibet were 111,054 pounds, but at the end he says, the trade returns do not show any export of Indian tea. So very quickly, we've seen the Chinese side, their arguments. I've pulled up what British materials I could on the actual state of the importation of Indian tea into Tibet. And we can just finish up by asking, what are the motivations? We can understand the serious fears and motivations in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But what are the motivations today to perpetuate and retell? And in fact, this area of studying Indian tea has become a niche area for Chinese academics. It's very strange. And we can perhaps ponder the motivations. Obviously, it's to prove the wickedness of the British and to uphold anti-colonial and anti-foreign sentiments. It can explain away many of the conflicts between the Han and the Tibetans in Kham, especially by blaming economic distress on the British. The whole story can show the Tibetans as being upright and loyal. The Tibetan people preferred Sichuan tea. They preferred Sichuan tea to Indian tea. The Tibetans hated the colonialists and even went so far as to boycott the colonialists. It can help explain the economic decline in Kanding and Kham, especially in the 1930s. It's a way to avoid talking about the very serious problem of opium in that whole area. It's a way to gloss over the loss of silver and gold. It can deflect criticism from the rather serious disruptions of the Red Army in the 1930s in that area. And it can provide excuses for the failure and the chaotic state of the local tea industry. In effect, British Indian tea is the thin edge of the wedge, and for showing the relentless and inevitable outcome of British policy. I'll just add my final thoughts, a few other things which the Chinese don't talk about. But British growers were never enthusiastic about making brick tea. It's complicated. I mean, this pressed little piece of thing, it actually takes about 18 procedural methods to make this. It's a complicated, difficult process. There was no enthusiasm because they were doing very well shipping tea to Europe anyway. Another reason is that, an important reason, the Tibetans never really took to the taste. The British would pass out samples in Darjeeling and other places in Kalimpong to Tibetans to try and encourage them to get enthusiastic about Indian tea. They never did. Tibetans through the centuries had come to depend on the particular taste, quality, and efficacy of brick tea from Sichuan. They also knew the brand names: Golden Tip, Flying Wheel, Rinchen Dorje, Double Dragon, which still exists today, and so forth. And then I've already presented the arguments and the delaying and protective tactics on the part of the Chinese and the Tibetans. So essentially, we see this Chinese bogeyman. We see the British trying to get their tea in, but unable to do so. So perhaps we could have a subtitle for this whole subject: Great Expectations and Great Fabrications. Thank you.
Thank you, Paddy. I realise you'd like to make some in the next paper. Questions?
Yes.
Who is very but Mantham Karto is also important.
So this is Nanikat.
Yeah, but Mantham Karto from late 17th century to maybe late 19th century, all the traders drinking tea and other commodities, they have to pay excise duty at Mantham Karto. Mantham Karto. So there are two Kartos, Ngari Karto and Mantham Karto. And just a small addition. When Adisha traveled to Tibet, he made a very, very interesting remark on the use of Tibetans' use of tea. And for me, this is one of the earliest remark by a foreigner. And then from 17th century to late 19th century, Tibetan government used to have two garban, Siling garban and Do garban. Both of these garban or can commander duty was business. The Do garban's duty was importing, exporting tea. And between 1835 to 1865, when Yaro Boman Namge cut all the goods from China to central Tibet, the decree issued by Tibetan government, why Tibetan government has to send a punitive expedition to Nyarong, in one of the reasons was cutting the jalam or the tea root of the three monasteries. And then between 1870 to 1871, 1869 to 1871, the famous Chanzo of the Gandhin Thiba, he made a special tea brand called Doja Gandhempa in Tanzeto. And finally, if anyone would like to see how Tibetan thinks about tea, what are the qualities and properties of the tea, if you go through a Neomic literature called Jajang Hamid Danger, it's a dispute between tea and chant. If you go through there are plenty of information. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, that's like, oh, no, it's a
Just a few. Could you please rephrase that tea was discovered by the Europeans or by the British? Because the local Singhos were drinking tea for centuries before that. Some were drinking, some were chewing. Next is regarding Tibet. The British people felt that the Tibetans were great tea drinkers, and they presumed, their ignorance was so great, they presumed tea grew in Tibet. And they commissioned a certain person called Booz to get tea plants from Tibet. And the history says that he couldn't get it because there was a civil war going on in Tibet. But that is what the British thought. Number three, they sent a person called Robert Fortune to get tea plants, and he went in certain disguises and tried to get the tea zone. The Chinese were very clever. They would never let him come close to the tea plantations. So he would view the tea estates from a long distance. And normally agriculture was on the flat land and tea was on the highlands, on the rocks and cliffs. Because agriculture was more important for survival and tea was more of a luxury. So Robert Fortune came back and reported to the British government, tea is grown on the steepest of hills and tea is plucked by monkeys because he was seeing it was a huge distance. And when the British planted tea in Darjeeling, they planted the tea at the steepest slopes, Alubari slope and Magaibari slope. And their knowledge of tea growing was so poor when they started the experimental plantation in 1839. Campbell was first to it. It took 17 years before they could actually make it a commercial viability. And lastly, the first Tibetan tea planter, regular tea planter, was from the Satsang family. Satsang family, they bought the annual tea estate near Calico, in Calico subdivision, around 1960s. And they tried very hard to sell that tea, big tea, and they didn't succeed. In all probably because Tibetans are hooked onto the Chinese tea. Thank you.
That makes sense.
It was a local Assamese who showed the Europeans what this tea was. So that's the date that I'm quoting there, which I have as 1823. Robert Fortune I am aware of, and he was very clever, and he would travel in disguise, and he's considered by the Chinese to this day as a spy and an espionage agent for going and finding out about Chinese tea.
Okay, I think I'm going to cut it there so that you keep room for free to schedule. I have a few questions myself. We'll take them later at tea time. Thank you, Patty.